Chapter 3. In the Williamson Valley country, the spring roundup, or rodeo, as it's called in Arizona, and the shipping are well over by the last June. During the long summer weeks until the beginning of the fall rodeo in September, there's little for the riders to do. The cattle roam free on the open ranges while calves grow into yearlings, and yearlings become 2-year-olds, and 2-year-olds mature for the market. On the Cross Triangle and similar ranches, 3 or 4 of the steadier year-round hands are only held. These repair and build fences and visit the watering places, brand an occasional calf that somehow managed to escape the dragnet of the rodeo, and with dope bottle ever at hand, doctor animals that are affected by screwworms. It is during these weeks, too, that the horses are broken, for with the hard and dangerous work of the fall and spring months, there's always need for fresh mounts. The horses of the Cross Triangle were never permitted to run on the open range, because the leaders of the numerous bands of wild horses that roamed over the country about Granite Mountain were always ambitious to gain recruitments for their harems from their civilized neighbors. The freedom of the ranch horses were limited by the fences of 4,000-acre pasture. But within these miles of barbed wire boundaries, the brood mares, with their growing progeny, lived as free and untamed as their wild cousins on the unfenced lands about them. The colts, except for one painful experience when they were roped and branded from the day of their birth until they were ready to be broken, were never handled. On the morning following his meeting with the stranger on the divide, Phil Acton, with 2 of his cowboy helpers, rode out to the big pasture to bring in the band. The owner of the Cross Triangle always declared that Phil was intimately acquainted with every individual horse and head of stock between the divide and Camp Wood Mountain, and from Skull Valley to the Big Chino. In moments of enthusiasm, the dean ever maintained stoutly that his young foreman knew as well every coyote, fox, badger, and deer, antelope, mountain lion, bobcat, and wild horse that had home or hunted country in the country in which the lad had ridden since he was a babyhood. Certainly, it was that Wild Horse Phil, as he was called by admiring friends, for reasons which you shall hear, loved this work and life to which he was born. Every feature of that wild land, from lonely mountain peak to hidden valley's canyon, was as familiar to him as the streets and buildings of a man's home city are known to the one reared among them. And as he rode that morning with his comrades to the day's work, the young man felt keenly the call of the primitive, unspoiled life that throbbed with such vital strength about him. He could not have put that into which he felt words. He was not even conscious of the forces that moved him so. He only knew that he was glad. The days of celebration at Prescott had been enjoyable days. To meet old friends and comrades, to ride with them in the contests that all true men of his kind love, to compare experiences and exchange news and gossip with widely spread neighbors, it was a pleasure. But the curious crowds of strangers, the throngs of sightseers from the to him unknown worlds of cities, who regarded him as they might view some rare or little-known creature in a mirageny, in the brazen presence of those unclean parasites and harpies that prey upon such occasions, had oppressed and disgusted him until he was glad to escape again to the clean freedom, the pure vitality, and the unspoiled spirit of his everyday life and environment. In an overflow of sheer physical and spiritual energy, he lifted his horse into a run, and with a shrill cowboy yell challenged his champions to ride wild with him to the pasture gate. It was some time before noon when Phil checked his horse near the ruins of the old Indian lookout on the top of Black Hill. Below, in the open land above Deep Wash, he could see his cowboy companions working the band of horses that were gathering slowly toward the narrow pass that at the eastern end of the Black Hills led through to the flats of the upper end of the big meadow, and so to the gate and to the way they followed to the corral. It was Phil's purpose to ride across Black Hill, down the western and northern slope and through the cedar timber, and pick up any horses that might arrange there, and join the others at the gate. In the meanwhile, there was time for a few minutes' rest. Dismounting, he loosened the girth and lifted the saddle and blanket from Hobson's steaming back. And then, while the good horse, wearied with the hard riding and the steady climb up the mountainside, stood quietly in the shade of a cedar, his master, stretched on the ground nearby, idly scanning the world that lay below him and around them. Very clear in that light atmosphere, Phil could see the trees and buildings of the home ranch, and just across the sandy wash from Cross Triangle the grove of cottonwoods and walnuts that hid the old house that he had been born in. A mile away, on the eastern side of the great valley meadows, he could see home buildings of Reed Ranch, the Pot Hook S, where Kitty Reed had lived all the days of her life except those 3 years which she had spent at school in the East. The young man on the top of Black Hill looked long at the Reed home. In his mind, he could see Kitty dressed in that cool, simple gown, fresh and dainty after the morning's housework, sitting with a book or sewing on the front porch. The porch on the other side of the house, it is true, and the distance was too great for him to distinguish a person in any case, but it made all no difference to Phil's vision. He could see her just the same. Kitty had been very kind to Phil at the celebration, but Kitty was always kind, nearly always. But in spite of her kindness, the cowboy felt that she had not somehow seemed to place a very high value on the medal he had won in the bronc riding contest. Phil himself did not greatly value the medal, but he wanted greatly to win the championship because of the very substantial money prize that went along with it. That money, in Phil's mind, was to play an important part in a long-cherished dream that was one of the things that Phil Acton did not talk about. He had not, in fact, ridden for the championship at all, but for his dream. And that was what mattered so much when Kitty seemed to lack so interest in his success. As though his subconscious mind directed the movement, the young man looked away from Kitty's home to the distant mountain range where the night before on the summit of the divide he had met the stranger. All the way home the cowboy had wondered about the man, evolving many theories, inventing many things to account for his presence, and alone and on foot, so far from surroundings to which he was so clearly accustomed. Of one thing Phil was sure. The man was in trouble, deep trouble. The more that the clean-minded, gentle-hearted lad of the great outdoors thought about it, the more strongly he felt he was unwittingly intruding on a moment that was sacred to that stranger. Sacred because the man was fighting one of those battles that every man must fight, and fight alone. It was this feeling that had kept the young man from speaking of the incident to anyone, even to the dean, or mother, as he called Miss Baldwin. Perhaps, too, this feeling was the real reason for Phil's sense of kinship with that stranger, for the cowboy himself had moments in his life where he would permit no man to look upon. But in his thinking of the man whose personality had impressed him so, one thing stood out above all things. The stranger clearly belonged to that world of which, from experience, the young foreman of the Cross Triangle knew nothing. Phil Acton had no desire for the world to which that stranger belonged, but in his heart there was some troublesome question. If he himself were more like the man whom he had met on the divide, if he knew more of that other world, if he in some degree belonged to that other world as Kitty, because of her 3 years in school, belonged, would it make a difference? From the distant mountain range that marks the eastern limits of the Williamson Valley country, and thus in the degree marked the limits of Phil's world, the lad's gaze turned again to the scene immediately before him. The band of horses, followed by the cowboys, were trotting from the narrow pass out into the open flat. Some of the band, the mothers, went quietly, knowing from past experiences that they in a few hours be returning to their freedom. Others, the colts and yearlings, bewildered, curious, and fearful, followed their mothers without protest, but those who in many friendly race or primitive battle had proved their growing years seemed to sense a coming crisis in their lives, hitherto peaceful. And these, as though warned by some strange instinct which guard all wild things, realized that the open ground between the pass and the gate presented that last opportunity, made a final desperate effort to escape. With sudden dashes and dodging and doubling, they tried again and again for freedom, but always between them and haunts they loved there was a persistent horseman, running, leaping, whirling to their efforts to be everywhere at once, and the riders working their charges towards the gate. The man on the hilltop sprang to his feet. Hobson threw up his head and with sharp ears forward eagerly watched the game he knew so well. With a quickness incredible to the untrained, Phil threw blanket and saddle to place. As he drew the clinch tight, a shrill cowboy yell came up from the flat below. One of the band, a powerful bay, had broken past the guarding horseman and was running with every ounce of his strength for the timber on the western slope of the Black Hill. For 100 yards, one of the riders had tried to overtake and turn the fugitive, but as he saw how the stride of the free horse was widening the distance between them, the cowboy turned back lest others follow the successful runaway's example. The yell was to inform Phil of the situation. Before the echoes of the signal could die away, Phil was in the saddle, and with an answering shout sent Hobson down the rough mountainside in a wild, reckless, plunging run to the head, for the moment, victorious bay. An hour later, the foreman rejoined his companions, who was holding the band of horses at the gate. The big bay, reluctant, protesting, twisting and turning in vain attempts to outmaneuver Hobson, was a captive in the loop of the wild horse Phil's riata. In the big corral that afternoon, Phil and his helpers, with the Dean and little Billy looking on, cut out from the herd the horses selected to be broken. These, one by one, were forced through the gate into the adjoining corral, from which they watched with uneasy wonder in many excited and ineffectual attempts to follow, when their more fortunate companions were driven again back to the big pasture. Then Phil opened another gate, and the little band dashed wildly through, to find themselves in a small meadow pasture, where they would pass the last night before the one great battle of their lives. A battle that would be for them a dividing point between those years of ease and freedom which had been theirs from birth, and the years of hard and useful service that were to come. Phil sat on his horse at the gate, watching with critical eye at the unbroken animals race away. "There's some good ones in this bunch this year, Uncle Phil," he commented to his employer, who was standing at the watering trough in the other corral, and he was looking over the fence. "There's bound to be some good ones in every bunch," returned Mr. Baldwin, "and some no accountin' others too," he added as his foreman dismounted beside him. Then, while the young man slipped the bridle from his horse and stood patiently for the animal to drink, the older man regarded him silently, as though in his own mind the Dean's observation bore somewhat upon Phil himself. That was always the way of the Dean. As Sheriff Fellows once remarked to Judge Palwell in the old days of the cattle rustler's glory, whatever Bill Baldwin says is mighty nigh always double-barreled. There was always two sides to the Dean, or rather, to be accurate, there was a front and a back. The back, flat, straight, and broad, indicated one side of his character, and the side that belonged with the square chin and blue eyes always looked at you with a frank directness. It was this side of the man that brought him barefooted and penniless to Arizona, in those days long ago when he was only a boy in Arizona, a strong man's country. It was this side of him that brought him triumphantly through those hard years of Indian trouble, and in those wild, lawless times made him respected and feared by the evildoers and trusted and followed by those of his kind. Out of hardships and danger in those turbulent days made the Arizona today. It was this side, too, that finally made the barefooted, penniless boy the owner of the Cross Triangle Ranch. I do not know the exact number of Dean's years. I only know that his hair is gray, and that he does not ride as much as he once did. I have heard him say, though, that when for 35 years he lived in the saddle, and that the Cross Triangle brand is one of the oldest irons in the state. I know, too, that his back is still flat and broad and straight. The Dean's front, so well-rounded and hardy, indicates as clearly as the other side of his character. And it is this side that belongs to the full red cheeks and the ever-ready chuckle or laugh, that puts the twinkle in the blue eyes and the kindly tones in his deep voice. It is this side of the Dean's character that adds so large a measure of love to the respect and confidence afforded to him by neighbors and friends, business associates and employees. It is this side of the Dean, too, that in these days sits in the shade of the big walnut trees, planted by his own hand, and talks to the youngsters of the days gone by, that makes the young riders of his generation seek him for counsel, sympathy, and help. 3 things the Dean knows: cattle, horses, and men. 1 thing the Dean will not, cannot tolerate: weakness in those who should be strong. Even bad men, he admits, if they are strong, not for their badness, but for their strength. Mistaken men he loved in spirit of their mistakes, if only they are not weaklings. There is no place anywhere in Dean's philosophy of life for a weakling. I heard him tell a man once, and never shall I forget it, "You had better die like a man, sir, than live like a sneaking coyote." The Dean's son, men grown, were gone from the home ranch to the fields and work of their choosing. Little Billy, a nephew of 7 years, was, Mr. and Mr. Baldwin said heartily, their second crop. When Phil's horse, satisfied, lifted his dripping muzzle from the watering trough, the Dean walked with his young foreman to the saddle shed. Neither of the men spoke, for between them there was a companionship that does not require a constant flow of talk to keep it alive. Not until the cowboy had turned his horse loose and was hanging the saddle and bridle on their accustomed peg did the older man speak. "Jim Reed's going to be breaking horses next week." "So I've heard," returned Phil, carefully spreading his blanket saddle to dry. The Dean spoke again in a tone of indifference. "He wants you to help him." "Me? What's the matter with Jack?" "He's going to the D1 tomorrow." Phil was examining the wrappings of his saddle horn with, as the Dean noted, quite unnecessary care. "Kitty was over this morning," said the Dean gently. The young man turned, and taking off his spurs and hung them up on the saddle horn. Then, as he kicked off his leather chaps, he said shortly, "I'm not looking for a job as a professional bronc buster." The Dean's eyes twinkled. "Well, thought maybe you'd like to help a neighbor out, just being neighborly, you know." "Do you want me to ride for Reed?" demanded Phil. "Well, I suppose as long as there's broncs to bust, someone's got to bust 'em," the Dean returned without committing himself. And then, when Phil made no reply, he added laughingly, "I told Kitty to tell him, though, that I reckon you had as big a string as you could handle over here." As they moved away from the house, Phil returned with significant emphasis, "When I ride for anyone besides you, it won't be for Kitty Reed's father." And the Dean commented in his reflecting tone, "It does sometimes make a difference who a man rides for, don't it?" In the pastures by the corral, the horses were awaiting the approaching trial that would mark them for the beginning of a new life past a restless night. Some, in meekness of spirit, or perhaps with a deeper wisdom, fed quietly. Others wandered about aimlessly, snatching an occasional uneasy mouthful of grass, and looked about often in troubled doubt. The more rebellious ones followed the fence, searching for some place of weakness in the barbed barrier that imprisoned them. And one, who, had he not been by circumstance robbed of his birthright, would have been the strong leader of a wild band, stood often with his wide nostrils and challenging eyes gazed towards the corrals and buildings, as if questioning the right of those who brought him there from the haunts that he loved. And somewhere, in the night of that land, which was as known to him as the pasture meadow, was the strange to the broken horses, a man awaited the day which, for him too, was to stand through all of his remaining years as a mark between the old life and the new. As Phil Acton lay in his bed, with doors and windows open wide to welcome the new, cool night air, he heard the restless horses in the pasture nearby and smiled as he thought of the big bay and the morrow. Smiled with the smile of a man who looked forward to a battle worthy of his best strength and skill. And then, strangely enough, as he slipped into the dreamless sleep of those who live as he lived, his mind went again to the stranger who he had met on the summit of the divide. If he were more like that man, would it make any difference? The cowboy wondered. End of chapter 3.